Listen and decide from the first breath whether you will remain ordinary or whether you will be altered by knowing what follows. This story begins in a valley so secluded that time itself seemed to misplace its clocks, a hollow where sound behaves as if the world were trying to keep a secret from itself. Picture the Ozark ridges at dusk, mist riding the hollows like a creature without shape, and imagine a single homestead nested in that silence, a compound of cabins and a main house holding a genealogy that refuses to obey nature's basic rules. This is not an invitation to voyeurism, it is a summons to learn the anatomy of concealment and the cost of a family that closed itself against the world until it became something else, a society within a homestead governed by rights that twisted love into possession and tradition into an iron law. You will hear names and notices and ledger entries, but names only matter when they anchor truth, and truth here is a delicate thing held together by ritual and fear and the careful maintenance of appearances. When Josiah arrived with his wife and 3 children, he brought a doctrine of isolation, a promise to shield his bloodline from what he called corruption, and at first that doctrine read like a simple religious austerity, a backward refuge in the wilderness for men who distrusted towns and newspapers and the city lights that announce modernity. But isolation is an incubator, and inside that valley the incubator turned human biology into a slow experiment, generations weaving themselves inward until family lines folded over themselves like paper being refolded into smaller and smaller shapes until no one remembered the first crease. Listen to the ledger notes in the minister's marginalia, they carry the small precise clues that build a case, a postscript that reads like a tremor in the foundation, an Ezekiel Porter who sold land and then fled west claiming the hollow was wrong somehow. Those are the breadcrumbs you will follow into darker rooms of meaning. Pay attention to Margaret's journals because they are the light that cuts through the cover of ritual. Her handwriting grows erratic as the years pass and the entries begin to whisper about ceremonies at full moon and marks made on foreheads and the children prepared for joining. She writes with the slow exhaustion of a woman witnessing the corrosion of motherhood into ordinance. You must accept an uncomfortable fact, that ordinary men can become the architects of catastrophe if they control the rules inside an enclosed system. Josiah's insistence that purity required certain unions was not merely folly, it was governance, and governance when unchecked becomes an engine of repetition until deformity is mistaken for purpose. This valley was perfect for a program of erasure, steep ridges that swallow sound, a single narrow trail to the outside, a basin that hides its breath from strangers and therefore hides its rot as well. The geography worked like a partner, enforcing separation until separation became identity and identity became the very idea of sanctity for those within. Do not look for violence at every turn, the horror here is quieter, it is normalization turned tyrant, it is the daily adjustments that make cruelty look like an act of faith, it is mothers convinced to bless what they cannot bear to name, it is children bred into likeness until their faces are maps of the same wound. You are hearing initiation, not gossip, and for those who listen closely the valley will reveal a curriculum, a lesson in how systems fold inward and forget the face of the world. Remember this first image, the basin at dusk, the main house watching like a sentinel and the hush around it like a promise that something would be enclosed and never spoken of again. Now listen and learn the mechanism of the cage. You are hearing about how a family turned doctrine into design and how a man called Josiah rewired normal life into ritual until the ritual swallowed truth. This is not merely about cruelty, it is about method, a deliberate architecture of isolation that converts habit into obedience and obedience into identity. Understand this and you will see how quickly a community can become a closed loop where feedback disappears and madness becomes policy. Inside that basin the Blackwoods did not only avoid the world, they invented practices that made escape unthinkable, marks on foreheads at full moon, circles of joining in which children were given names that bound them to lineage rather than personhood, the breaking of mirrors because reflection breeds doubt, salt lines at thresholds whispered to hold away corruption. Each act a small stitch that together formed an invisible net tightening around bodies and minds. Pay attention to the domestic details because they are the instruments of control. Mothers taught to respond with the same phrase at the same moment, meals offered at fixed times as ceremony not nourishment, the repetition of songs that contained coded instructions, small rituals performed so often they became reflex, and reflex is the raw material of identity when individuals are born into it and know nothing else. Margaret's handwriting slips in the journal when she tries to name the things she could not prevent. She writes about the cave and of girls taken there to be changed. She writes of learning to lie to protect the family and then of losing the ability to know whether her lies were for protection or punishment. This is critical because the internalization of guilt is one of the most efficient tools authority can wield. Guilt keeps people aligned without need for visible force. Consider the role of language within the homestead. The Blackwoods developed a cadence of speech that served as both greeting and command, an altered grammar that encoded hierarchy and consent. When Josiah spoke a phrase, it was not just a sentence, it was an ordinance. Speech acted as ritual and ritual as law, and when law is embedded in everyday talk, it becomes invisible and therefore unassailable. You must also note the use of spaces, small cells upstairs barred from one side, dolls arranged in circles as training devices, carved images of ancestors placed to watch, architecture used as pedagogy, children taught to fear the open sky and to love the confines of their rooms. The house itself became a teacher instructing bodies how to move and how to belong. Power uses scarcity to sharpen dependence. In the Blackwood compound, access to the world was rare and always mediated by Josiah. He controlled when wagons left and who received medicine. He withheld letters and refused to post them. Isolation was his instrument and secrecy his currency. And with control over information, he controlled reality for those inside the basin. Now translate this into your world and you will see the same pattern at scale. When institutions restrict information, when rituals of behavior are enforced without explanation, when leaders substitute mystery for accountability, those are the conditions under which entire populations can be trained to accept limits that once would have seemed intolerable. Hold this as a warning and as a skill. To spot the architecture of enclosure, look for repeated domestic prescriptions that demand obedience, look for language turned into law, look for ritualized scarcity that produces dependence, and understand that when you remove external checks, a man like Josiah can turn a family into an instrument of his will. This section is a lesson in the quiet instruments of domination. Learn it well and you will never again mistake ordinary habit for harmless tradition. Now you must learn to recognize mimicry as a weapon and to feel how a closed system teaches itself to replace flesh with pattern and then call the replacement family. Mimicry begins with observation and practice, a slow tuning of posture, of pauses, of a favorite phrase repeated until it fits like a borrowed voice. In the Blackwood Basin, imitation did not arrive by accident, it was cultivated for purpose. Elders taught which gestures reassured the patriarch, which songs quelled suspicion, which glances confirmed allegiance, and over generations those lessons accumulated into a grammar of sameness that made substitution possible without noise. Listen to the testimony of Deputy Hayes, who wrote about delayed shadows and responses. These details are not poetic embellishment but the sign language of a system learning its own limits and then erasing them by copying outward form while hollowing interior experience. Imagine a child taught from birth to repeat a line at the sound of a bell. Imagine that child becoming an adult who answers the world by rote. Then picture that adult replaced by someone who has learned the line perfectly but feels nothing when they speak it. The social error goes unnoticed because form is honored over the living content that gives form meaning. This is how trust is neutralized, by making the surface indistinguishable from the original, and once trust is neutralized, the very concept of identity becomes fungible, a currency to be traded among those who control the ceremony of recognition. Consider the practical mechanics that make mimicry effective in small places. Close quarters provide endless rehearsal rooms, rituals become audition spaces. The cave mentioned in Margaret's journal may have served as a chamber where voices were trained and where responses were tuned until they matched memory closely enough to pass inspection. Sound matters because we are social animals wired to read timing, cadence, the tiny delays that betray pretense. The cave in such a theory would be an instrument that reshapes perception by reinforcing certain frequencies and dampening others so that replicated voices seem authentic even when they are hollow within. Power amplifies mimicry when it turns ritual into law. When leaders insist that only certain behaviors prove loyalty, the enforcement of those rituals creates selective pressure for imitation and elevates imitators into positions where they can teach more imitation, a feedback loop that accelerates substitution until the original cannot be distinguished by casual inspection. You must also see how isolation multiplies the effect because without external reference points there is no check on authenticity. A valley sealed from discussion is an incubator where pattern replaces memory and where the living memories that might expose imitation are starved by absence of comparison. This is why officials later erased records and why the basin could vanish from maps. Evidence is the oxygen of verification, and when the oxygen is removed, the human world forgets its own rules and accepts replicas as residents in history as tidy again. Learn to spot mimicry in 3 vectors. First, the behavioral signature where multiple people share the same odd pause or phrase. Second, the ritual infrastructure where homes and objects are arranged to rehearse behavior. And third, the administrative silence where records are sealed and questions discouraged. When these 3 align, you are watching a system that has learned to replace humanity with pattern, and your obligation as someone awake is to value dissonance where others seek harmony, to ask why sameness is enforced and to insist that verification remains alive in the face of any ritual that forbids reflection. This knowledge is dangerous because it reveals how easily identity can be manipulated, but it is also liberating because once you can name the method you can refuse to be part of the rehearsal, and in refusing you break the pattern that makes substitution possible. Now we move into the ethics of silence and the calculus that turns compassion into complicity. Listen, because this section will teach you how institutions decide which stories live and which are buried, how civic dignity can be weaponized to erase discomfort rather than to heal it. When Sheriff Ledbetter wrote that knowledge of the Blackwoods would harm the county, he spoke in the language of preservation, but what preservation becomes when it hides truth is a form of governance that chooses image over inquiry, and image is a fragile currency that fears contamination more than it seeks justice. You must understand that suppression is rarely a single act, it is a choreography of small choices enacted by people who prefer stability to the painful work of exposure, judges who sign orders without full hearings, doctors who redact notes to spare sensibilities, editors who sell their presses and move on rather than risk scandal, each act a stitch in the larger shroud that will smother a story. Consider the practical reasons they give: the reputation of the county, the protection of hapless descendants, the avoidance of sensationalism in print. These reasons can sound noble enough to convince decent men to close their mouths and their records, and in that acquiescence the machinery of erasure is built piece by piece until the past is a void and the present is a story with the edges burned away. But there is another motive that rarely admits itself openly, the motive of power that fears precedent because precedent invites scrutiny and scrutiny risks contagion. If one valley hides a monstrous deviation, what prevents other valleys from being examined, and what destabilizes the neat narratives that hold institutions together is the admission that human systems can harbor such abnormalities unseen for decades. So officials chose containment rather than confrontation, and containment has its own logic: to move survivors under new names to distant institutions, to fund their care anonymously to avoid scandal, to displace physical evidence by bureaucratic reclassification, and to claim that the decision was made for mercy rather than for concealment. You need to see how mercy can be co-opted into a tool of silence, how the language of charity can be written into legal orders that make records disappear, and how the rhetoric of protection can be used to justify the removal of facts from public memory. This is why historians like Harrington and Pute were obstructed, why their files vanished in fires that may have been accidents, and why research notes were seized or lost, not always by conspiracy but often through the slow erosion of institutional will and the quiet compliance of those who prefer their careers intact to the pursuit of truth that invites ruin. Think about how communities behave under the pressure of such a secret. Family members who once remembered choose forgetfulness to preserve their social standing. Children taught to avoid the subject carry the habit forward. Generational silence becomes a cultural reflex until the story itself becomes a taboo even to whisper in private. You are learning to recognize the stages of erasure. First there is discomfort, second there is a decision to manage the discomfort, third there is the construction of protocol, and finally there is the normalization of omission. And when omission becomes normal, history itself is rewritten by neglect rather than by malice, and that is the most destructive form of forgetting because it looks like ordinary life while it hollows memory from within. Hold this as a critical skill. When you encounter institutional silence, ask what is being preserved and who benefits from the preservation. Demand documentation, not rhetoric, and remember that mercy without transparency is often the first language of concealment. This lesson prepares you to see the Blackwood case not as an isolated cruelty but as a template for how societies choose what to remember and what to bury, and from that recognition your responsibility changes from passive curiosity to active witness. Now you must learn how ritual becomes infrastructure and how a household can be rebuilt into a system that trains obedience as if it were a craft. This is where the Blackwood experiment crosses from barbarity into method, and you must see the cold efficiency that makes it endure. Listen as I show you how space was repurposed into curriculum, upstairs cells converted into classrooms of repression, dolls arranged not as toys but as lesson aids, patterns carved into walls as mnemonic devices, Everything engineered to narrow possibility until the only option left is compliance. Margaret's entries show the slow corrosion of moral sense, at first a whisper of doubt, then the terrible rationalizations that follow. I taught her the marks because he said it was sacred, she writes, and in that lie you can hear the mechanism of complicity being forged, a mother teaching what she hates because the system has made hatred indistinguishable from survival. You must notice the cave motif because it is not mere geography, it is ritual theater, a place to punish, to teach, and possibly to perform acts of transformation whose meaning the family would never publicly explain. The cave appears in private notes as a site where those who resist are taken to be broken and remade into acceptable copies of obedience. Think about the sensory terror Margaret records. The child returned from the cave with eyes that do not meet yours, a voice that sounds like a recorder, movements that hesitate as if learning new timings. These are not merely clinical observations, they are evidence of training by constraint, practice under duress until imitation becomes indistinguishable from identity for those who never see another way of being. The Patriarch's book is the other axis of power, a private codex that shaped doctrine and justified practice. Its language unknown, it functions like a charter for isolation, an ideological seal against outside reasoning, and a book is an inheritance that outlives a man. It teaches after the author is gone, and that is how rituals persist across generations even when their original purpose would have long ago been questioned. You must also track the use of scarcity as pedagogy, medicine rationed, movement restricted, letters withheld, access to town controlled. Scarcity sharpens obedience because it converts desire into barter and barter into servitude. Those who hold the goods hold the means to define reality for others, and Josiah knew this well and wielded it like a priest with a ledger. Observe how the family weaponized shame, the women silent under bonnets, habits taught to hide faces so outsiders cannot learn subtleties that might betray difference. Shame is a policing tool that limits curiosity in both the oppressed and the observer, and is why the public record remained thin for so long, because even witnesses protected their own reputations by staying silent. The medical notes reveal a similar coldness, clinical descriptors that depersonalize people into subjects and allow removal to institutions to be called charity, so the state becomes a partner in erasure when it accepts depersonalization as reason to reclassify human beings rather than to heal them in public view. You must see too how ritual and architecture produce collusion among the local elite. Judges, sheriffs, doctors, merchants each has a role in the theater of suppression, some motivated by civic pride, others by fear of contagion to reputation, and together they form a quiet chain that can sever memory from record and convert scandal into silence without the need for forceful conspiracies. Carry this section as a lens. When you see a family or institution that formalizes secrecy into practice, you are seeing not merely deception but a governance model. It teaches obedience and then feeds on that obedience until identity itself is reshaped to fit the design. That reshaping is the true crime here, because it is the slow removal of personhood under the guise of preservation. Hold steady now, because the next part will turn outward into the social network beyond the hollow and show you how this model finds patrons and protectors who tidy the historical record in exchange for the comfort of plausible deniability. Now you will learn how power moves beyond a single homestead into networks that tidy history and protect reputations. This is where the Blackwood case stops being an isolated horror and becomes a template for institutional erasure and managerial mercy. Listen to how money and discretion conspire. An anonymous trust appears in the records offering funds for care with no names attached. Those funds arrive as kindness and depart as silence, because when resources are provided quietly they purchase more than comfort. They purchase the disappearance of questions and the substitution of narratives that soothe the public conscience. Consider the roles of judges and sheriffs and physicians not as villains but as professionals who face a choice between public reckoning and plausible calm. Imagine the pressure when a county is told by its own leaders that publicity will ruin commerce and reputation, and that the safest path is to move survivors out of sight and into the care of institutions under new identities. This is not always malice, it is often a bureaucratic logic that prefers tidy outcomes, a logic that rationalizes secrecy as stewardship, and stewardship when unexamined becomes custodianship of a story that never reaches sunlight again. Note the pattern of intervention and relocation. Children placed in orphanages given new documents and new names, health records redacted, coroner reports misfiled, and when the search for provenance begins decades later the trail is thin by design. The institutional apparatus has converted memory into procedure and procedure into forgetfulness. Here the signatures of complicity in private letters where officials reassure each other that discretion has prevailed, the language is clinical and the intent clear, protection of the innocent they say, mitigation of scandal they say, but the result is the same, erasure of the people who mattered into archives that will not speak without permission. Think about the professionals involved, doctors who redact notes under the claim of public sensibility, a physician who later kills himself leaving private journals that name the degradation of his own practice, a sheriff who writes that reputation matters more than curiosity. These are not stories of singular greed but of social maintenance where institutions preserve their own ability to govern by denying messy exceptions the light of inquiry. Now widen your lens to include patronage and money. The anonymous trust that funded the care of certain patients suggests that someone with means sought containment rather than exposure. Money buys options and options create plausible deniability. When wealthy interests have ties to local elites, the option to remove records and reclassify existence becomes available, and the temptation to use it is strong for those who see scandal as contagion. You must also understand the human cost. Survivors uprooted and shunted into orphanages or institutions where adaptation is a daily ordeal, children taught to accept new names and new faces, their identities split like a cracked mirror so that no single reflection holds the whole truth, and the community that once sustained them dissolves into silence and shame. Recognize too the danger in the slow professionalization of concealment. When archivists and clerks are trained to seal boxes labeled sensitive and when editors are counseled to avoid stories that attract ruin, concealment becomes a career path and careers defend the silence that sustains them. This is how systems protect themselves, not by brute force but by bureaucratic choreography, by funds and forms and redactions, by polite letters that lock memory behind permissions and procedures, and in doing so they transform a human tragedy into an administrative footnote that future historians must pry open with effort and risk. Hold this understanding as a weapon. When you confront institutional silence, demand not platitudes but records. When you see anonymous funding, ask who benefits. When you hear professional language that sanitizes horror, respond with the names of those who were silenced and refuse the comfort of tidy explanations that erase people to preserve pride. Now you must widen your vision and understand how a single hollow becomes a network, because isolated horrors never remain isolated for long when those with means prefer discretion over disclosure. See how money and lineage weave a protective web that spans courts and churches and banks. Notice how an anonymous trust appears as charity and functions as containment. Funds flowing not to heal but to hide, a quiet purchase of oblivion that costs far less than scandal and buys far more than silence. Imagine the conversations behind closed doors where judges and merchants and ministers speak in the language of risk and reputation. They do not say cover up, they say stewardship. They do not call it erasure, they call it mercy, and mercy dressed in expedience becomes an armor for everyone who prefers polished facades to ugly truths. Pay attention to the signatures and the stamps, to the letters we later find in boxes marked private where local elites reassure one another that discretion has been secured, promises exchanged like currency, the ledger of conscience balanced against the ledger of power, and the latter outweighs the former every time. This is not always conspiracy as imagined by those who see men in capes, it is social maintenance. It is the polite management of awkward facts by professionals who fear the contagion of precedent, because precedent invites scrutiny and scrutiny threatens every neat hierarchy that depends on ignorance to thrive. Look at the path of the researchers who touched this wound. They found funding stalled, archives closed, interviews aborted by relatives whispering that some things are best left in memoryless dark, then one after another they receive advice to stop, cautions that come with kindness and a pointed implication that careers cost more than curiosity in a small town that values its peace. Hear the rhythm of obstruction: a file misplaced, a box mislabeled, a burn notice from a furnace that may have been faulty and may not, a sudden reassignment for an eager archivist who was asking the wrong questions at the wrong time. These are not grand conspiratorial moves, they are mundane bureaucratic acts that accumulate into effective suppression because institutions are excellent at self-preservation when the cost of truth looks like chaos. Understand the human price hidden inside these administrative gestures. The children moved to orphanages, given new names to protect them from stigma, and then taught to forget, identities erased gently as if in service, and yet forgetting is violence when it is forced upon the young who had no say in the bargain struck for them. Notice too the subtle alliances: wealthy families with old county ties who once joked about bloodlines at dinners, men who quietly sponsor anonymous funds and in doing so secure a zone of non-inquiry, patrons who claim charity while ensuring the narrative ends where they prefer it to end, their generosity a soft threat because it buys silence and gratitude in equal measure. You must learn the mechanics of polite concealment. When you see an anonymous trust, ask for ledgers. When you see redactions in medical reports, demand original notes. When you encounter official language that sanitizes misery into clinical terms, insist on testimony that names people, not categories. Without names there is no culpability, and without culpability there is simply a managed story that comforts the living at the cost of the dead. This network is the shadow infrastructure of social order. It is composed of letters and bank drafts and whispered assurances, a cartilage that holds the face of a community in place while its bones are rearranged beneath. And once you can see the infrastructure, you can begin to dismantle it by tracing the paper trail and exposing the polite bargains made in the name of reputation. Keep this as a tool, not as cynicism, because knowing the shape of protection lets you ask the right questions for those who cannot ask them themselves, and exposing how mercy mutates into concealment is the first step toward justice for people reduced to statistics in the name of civic dignity. Now you begin to see that the silence surrounding the Blackwood name was not just protection, it was transformation, a metamorphosis engineered by those who understood that if a story cannot be destroyed it can be rewritten, and rewriting is the art of civilized control. Listen closely, because this is where the narrative shifts from physical secrecy to psychological management, where the tools of suppression become the instruments of belief, and the lie becomes so vast it feels safer than the truth itself. When the institutions moved the surviving children, they did not just change their names, they crafted new histories, assigning them birthplaces that never existed and relatives drawn from forged records. Even the dates of their arrival were adjusted so that the trail of their lineage could not be reconstructed. The erasure of blood became a clerical act, not a crime. And those who orchestrated it began to build a doctrine around their decision, teaching that some stories must be forgotten for the good of the many, that public faith depends on collective ignorance, and that moral order is sustained not by truth but by the careful management of lies that keep the system intact. You must recognize that this is the true genius of power. It does not destroy opposition, it educates it into obedience. It creates layers of perception so refined that you mistake your own conditioning for moral conviction. You think you are defending decency when you are defending secrecy that serves hierarchy. In those years after 1894, pamphlets appeared warning against rural degeneracy and advocating stricter controls on who could marry whom. Laws were proposed not to protect but to prevent, cloaked in the language of purity and progress, and though they never named the hollow, their logic was born from it, from fear disguised as reform. The Ozark clergy gave sermons about moral infection, using the Blackwood legend as cautionary parable without ever admitting its factual roots, and this is how myth and truth fused, myth to teach fear and truth to justify it, until fear became governance itself. Notice how even universities complied by omission. Anthropology professors cataloged folk tales of mountain deformity while ignoring the documents locked away in courthouse basements, their papers cited by lawmakers to pass eugenic measures decades later, proving that knowledge can be perverted simply by deciding what not to see. You are being shown how systems metabolize guilt. They do not atone, they redirect. They create new policies to give the illusion of purification while the real purpose is containment of the shame that might ignite revolt. Every generation taught that their silence protects civilization when in truth it imprisons it. This pattern repeats across centuries and empires, always the same rhythm, a transgression, a cleanup, a doctrine, and a forgetting, until the event is no longer a scandal but a foundation myth for the next layer of control, and by then no one remembers where the fear came from, only that it must be obeyed. Now pause and feel the weight of this realization, that every lie told to preserve peace builds a future that cannot bear truth, that mercy without memory is a kind of curse that ensures the same corruption will rise again wearing different faces but serving the same order. This is where the descent deepens, because once you see how narratives are managed you can never unsee it, and from this point forward your awareness becomes a rebellion in itself, a silent refusal to be programmed by the myths that power tells to make obedience look like virtue. You are now deep enough to see how truth becomes a contagion and how those in command engineer containment not with chains but with belief. This is where fear evolves into design and where the Blackwood silence becomes a model for national behavior. After 1894 the region was scrubbed of reference, property reassigned, maps redrawn, the hollow renamed twice within a decade, and this erasure was done not to hide geography but to obscure memory, Because memory breeds inquiry, and inquiry is the one virus authority can never vaccinate against. You must understand the new machinery that rose in the years that followed: institutions of hygiene, eugenic councils, mental health boards, all formed under the promise of progress, yet all born from the same seed that grew in that cursed hollow, the belief that deviance must be managed quietly for the good of the collective. They studied cases like the Blackwoods under other names, filing them as rural degeneracy, as genetic unfitness, as cautionary specimens to justify laws that gave the state power over marriage and reproduction, and what began as one family's nightmare became a doctrine written into policy. You have to see how power evolves. It learns from its mistakes, it dresses cruelty in the vocabulary of reason, it sanitizes horror into data and transforms empathy into protocol until compassion itself becomes a method of control. By the early 1900s, Missouri officials shared these studies with Eastern universities, and their findings were repackaged into reports that would later feed the eugenic movement across America, a movement that sterilized thousands and justified it as the purification of the race, all while citing the same logic once whispered in the Ozark Hills. The Blackwood silence thus became the cornerstone of a philosophy that preached cleanliness of blood, and this philosophy was not fringe, it was endorsed by scientists, professors, ministers, and lawmakers, proof that when intellect serves fear it becomes more dangerous than ignorance ever was. Hear this clearly: when power finds a moral mask it becomes untouchable, it no longer needs violence because its victims defend it in the name of virtue, and so men sterilized women for their own good, priests blessed the work as mercy, and bureaucrats called it efficiency, all repeating the cycle of concealment first perfected in that mountain hollow. Now imagine what this does to generations raised under such reasoning. Men taught that authority is protection, that obedience is intelligence, that skepticism is rebellion, and rebellion is sickness. Such men become their own jailers, guarding the walls built from the lies of their forefathers. You must see that this is how psychological control becomes inherited, not through direct command but through culture, through stories retold until the lie feels safer than the truth, until each generation polices itself in fear of awakening the memory buried by its ancestors. At this point in our descent you are not just hearing history, you are confronting its ghost living inside your own assumptions, and here is where I will ask you to do something that marks your passage through this initiation. Comment the phrase "I see the hidden order" twice below, write it twice to seal this awareness, because repetition is how conditioning works, and now you use it as a weapon to undo the programming that power relies on. You have crossed the midpoint of the descent, and from here the revelations will cut deeper, into how this system of managed truth shaped not only policy but the very mind of the modern citizen who mistakes safety for freedom and obedience for peace. Now the descent turns inward because the machinery of control is no longer confined to courtrooms or institutions, it lives inside the mind, and once you recognize its architecture you begin to see how the same pattern that buried the Blackwood truth became the blueprint for the modern psyche. Understand this and you will never again confuse obedience for morality. The power that once erased a family in the Ozarks now erases your own capacity to question by teaching you to love your cage and call it civilization. When the eugenic councils dissolved, their rhetoric did not die, it evolved. Their language of purification turned into the vocabulary of optimization, the idea that man must be improved, managed, perfected in measurable ways. This new gospel migrated into schools, industries, governments. It became the doctrine of efficiency and self-surveillance. In the early decades of the 20th century, the same universities that studied the Blackwood silence began to study the human mind, not to free it but to map it, to quantify obedience and deviance as traits to be engineered, and in that pursuit they built the foundations of modern psychological control. Every test, every form, every assessment is the refined echo of those early doctrines, a system that categorizes thought the way the old councils categorized blood. The aim is the same: to define normality so that anything beyond it can be corrected, reformed, neutralized. You see it today in the quiet language of progress in phrases like social harmony, public safety, behavioral correction, each a softened descendant of the same logic that once justified sterilization and segregation. The vocabulary changes, the power remains the same. This is how power hides in plain sight. It no longer burns records, it simply rewrites perception. It teaches people to police themselves through shame and fear of exclusion. It convinces you that belonging is survival and that truth is a luxury you cannot afford because comfort pays better. When they built those early institutions for the displaced children of the Hollow, they were creating more than asylums. They were constructing prototypes of controlled environments, places where routine becomes morality and compliance becomes virtue. That model now extends to every corner of organized life. Think about the architecture of your day: the bells that regulate your time, the systems that record your productivity, the metrics that define your worth. These are the modern rituals born from the same obsession with order that once turned the Ozark horror into a case study of improvement through control. They learn that the body need not be chained when the mind can be taught to chain itself, and this revelation was the most dangerous knowledge ever discovered because it allowed cruelty to masquerade as care forever. You must confront this truth without flinching. The same principles that silence the Hollow now whisper through your screens, your policies, your corporate creeds: the belief that submission is progress, that obedience is intelligence, that questioning authority is an illness in need of correction. From this point forward, your awakening becomes resistance. Every insight a fracture in the smooth surface of manipulation, every act of awareness a rebellion against the unseen inheritance of that forgotten Hollow. The system still feeds on silence, and your refusal to stay silent is how you begin to starve it. Now the shadows stretch wider, because the story of the Hollow was never meant to end in the mountains. It was meant to evolve, to migrate into the bloodstream of a civilization that thrives on forgetting its own sins. And the same silence that once hid the Blackwoods became a template for how nations hide their own deformities under the language of order. Look back at the timing and you will see the pattern. The late 19th century marked not just the age of industrial expansion but the birth of institutional obedience: governments learning to convert citizens into units, churches learning to translate guilt into compliance, schools learning to manufacture loyalty disguised as enlightenment. Each mechanism grew from the same soil that swallowed the Hollow: fear made manageable through structure, structure made sacred through repetition, repetition made invisible through normalization, until control became culture itself. The patriarch of that family wanted to perfect his bloodline, the state wanted to perfect its citizens, the corporations that followed wanted to perfect their workers. It is the same hunger disguised as progress, and every new form of governance merely updates the tools while preserving the old desire to design humanity itself. You must learn to trace this hunger through symbols and rituals, because power never announces itself directly. It hides inside architecture, logos, oaths, songs, pledges, all of them subtle sermons teaching obedience without question while convincing the believer that submission is patriotism and conformity is virtue. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, the new systems of control no longer needed myth or threat. They had engineered comfort into obedience. Prosperity became the new religion, and in prosperity people forget to ask who defines its boundaries. The silence that once smothered the Hollow became mass entertainment, distraction as a national anesthetic, media as the new church, programming as liturgy, each broadcast teaching the same moral: that peace requires forgetting, that curiosity is danger, that contentment is the only acceptable freedom. When those who searched for the Blackwood truth returned decades later, they found not resistance but indifference, locals smiling politely, unwilling to reopen graves, not because they feared the story but because they no longer cared to disturb the illusion of peace that forgetting had purchased for them. That indifference is the final phase of control, when memory becomes unnecessary and questions sound like treason. When people laugh at their own blindness because laughter feels safer than awakening, that is when silence has completed its evolution into faith. Understand this clearly: faith can be the most powerful form of programming when it is engineered not from revelation but from repetition, when words lose their original purpose and become reflexes that protect the system from scrutiny, and in that reflex the ghost of the Hollow still breathes, whispering that obedience is love and ignorance is grace. So when you hear men speak of patriotism or progress or public order, listen for the cadence beneath the words, because it is the same rhythm that once pulsed through the rituals of that cursed family, the rhythm of preservation through purification, of order through erasure, of control disguised as care. You are no longer hearing a story of a forgotten valley, you are staring into the mirror of civilization itself, and the reflection is showing you that the Hollow never ended, it simply changed its address and learned to smile. Now we descend into the quiet corridors of modern obedience, where the tools of control no longer wear uniforms or badges but exist as invisible hands inside every choice you think is your own and every comfort you mistake for freedom. The Hollow was a prototype, a raw experiment in containment, but the world you now inhabit is the finished architecture, the perfected system where silence is no longer enforced by fear but by convenience, where truth dies not by execution but by neglect. Look at the design of your environment, the glowing screen that tracks your gaze, the invisible algorithms that predict your desires before you name them. These are the same mechanisms that once mapped the minds of the broken children from that mountain. They record, they analyze, they correct, they rewrite reality in real time, and they call it connection. When you scroll, you participate in a ritual older than you know, a ritual of surrender dressed as choice. Every swipe a prayer, every click a confession, and every data point a piece of your soul cataloged into a structure that does not need to command, it only needs to suggest. This is the modern language of power, not orders but options. Too many to resist, too effortless to refuse, a system that understands human weakness better than any god ever could, because it has studied every impulse, every hesitation, every pattern of distraction that keeps you docile while believing you are awake. You must see the inheritance of the hollow here. The patriarch forced his bloodline to serve his belief, but the new masters persuade you to volunteer yours. They offer belonging, they offer comfort, they offer recognition, and all they ask in return is your quiet compliance. Consider how obedience has evolved. It is no longer demanded through threat, it is gamified, rewarded with dopamine, with affirmation, with the illusion of significance. The leash has become invisible, and that is why it never breaks. Think of the architecture of control embedded in your work, your media, your relationships. You are monitored not by men with ledgers but by systems that learn from your emotions. They know how long you linger on an image, what tone of fear keeps you watching, what shape of outrage keeps you speaking without acting. This is the final refinement of the doctrine born in that hollow, the fusion of curiosity and captivity, where you participate in your own surveillance and defend it because it entertains you, where the mirror itself becomes the cage and you polish it daily so you will not see the bars. And just as the elders of that mountain replaced love with ritual, modern power replaces truth with engagement. It does not care what you believe, only that you remain connected, feeding the network that feeds on attention, which in turn feeds the machinery that defines your sense of self. You must learn to look at every device, every advertisement, every institution with the same suspicion that Harrington once looked at those sealed courthouse boxes, because inside each polished surface lies a mechanism designed to erase the parts of you that might still remember how to disobey. From here forward, the descent is no longer about the past, it is about the present. It is about you standing at the threshold between awareness and the comforting lie you were trained to call normal. There are stories buried beneath the Ozarks that were never written on paper because those who carried them knew paper could be found, but memory could hide longer. Memory could whisper through generations until even the soil itself began to keep secrets, and the trees grew twisted around what was left unsaid. What happened after the patriarch fell was not peace, it was silence, and silence has always been the truest sign of control. His descendants scattered, some changed their names, some built churches, and others became part of the institutions that once sought to erase them, yet the blood never forgot, it only adapted, learning to wear civility like armor. When the state records finally reopened decades later, researchers found something that made their skin tighten: census sheets with missing families' birth certificates replaced by symbols, and a stretch of land listed as owned by no one but still taxed every year as though the government itself feared to release it. And on that forgotten acreage stood a single farmhouse rebuilt by unseen hands, its windows blacked out from within, its yard always damp even in drought. Those who ventured too close heard the sound of movement underground, slow, rhythmic, deliberate, like the shifting of earth trying to breathe. Locals began to speak of the root people. They said the last surviving kin had gone below, built a warren beneath the house, a self-contained world fed by natural springs, and the remains of those who came before, an inverted Eden where worship and punishment had become one, where the family tree quite literally fed upon itself. No lawman dared dig, no church claimed authority, because to do so would mean acknowledging that the experiment had never ended, it had merely gone to seed and spread through the veins of the land itself. The hollow had become the blueprint of a system that could thrive in darkness because it had learned to make darkness holy. You might think these are just backwoods tales, but every legend has a utility. It teaches, it warns, it preserves what cannot be spoken directly. The story of the root people became a myth that explained why certain boundaries were never crossed, why certain hills never sold, why the government's maps still leave portions of the Ozarks shaded like bruises. Those who hike too deep there report an unease not of fear but of recognition, as if something ancient is studying them through the soil, matching their heartbeat to its rhythm, asking wordlessly if they too are ready to come home. And maybe that is the truest horror, not that evil exists but that it endures, not that the family was destroyed but that it evolved, invisible, unstoppable, woven into every hierarchy, every ritual, every institution that values obedience over truth, because that is what the hollow taught the world how to do. The story you are hearing is not about a place, it is about inheritance, the transfer of control from one century to the next, from one mind to another, until even those who resist begin to mirror the patterns they despise, until the hunter becomes the mechanism, until you realize the mountain never needed to trap you physically, it only needed to teach you how to trap yourself. By the early 1900s, the land records of that section of the Ozarks had become a riddle, whole acres unclaimed yet consistently taxed, names of non-existent heirs repeated through multiple generations as if time itself had been edited by hand, historians attempting to catalog the family's met, sealed archives and unsigned letters warning them to leave the past where it lay. But curiosity is a form of hunger, and hunger always returns to what fed it once before. A government surveyor named Thomas Renfield made the mistake of asking why the hollow remained exempt from property reassessment. His journal, which surfaced decades later, reads like a descent into delirium. He describes entering the area on horseback under a sunless haze, the light flattening into shades of gray even at midday, the air thick as though something unseen was exhaling from the ground. Renfield wrote that he saw figures in the distance, not moving but swaying in slow rhythm as if tethered to a silent pulse. When he approached, the figures were not people but crude effigies woven from branches, bones and hair arranged in a circle around a stone basin carved with symbols matching those found in early indigenous burial mounds, except these had been altered, blended with markings of European origin, something unnatural born of two worlds forced together. He stayed one night at an abandoned cabin and claimed he heard movement under the floorboards, voices that rose and fell in perfect cadence. He could not discern words, only tone, one voice commanding, the others answering in broken unison. He wrote that it was not prayer, it was rehearsal. When Renfield returned to the county office, his mind was shattered. He refused to speak of what he saw, and within weeks he vanished, leaving behind his journal and a map with certain areas marked in red circles, each circle accompanied by a single word: root. It was around that time local newspapers began reporting an increase in disappearances, mostly travelers, drifters, loggers whose names were easily forgotten. The authorities dismissed it as coincidence, but older residents whispered that the family had returned not as flesh and blood but as function, a living network that fed on fear itself. If you study the region's infrastructure, you find something strange: schools built on fault lines, old chapels relocated on survey errors, rail lines rerouted through uninhabitable valleys. It is as though the land itself demanded tribute, a pattern of human settlement shaped by something older than planning, older than law, something guiding the hand of civilization from beneath. Every generation someone digs, and every generation the ground takes something back. This is the quiet pact between progress and memory, the reason why even now the Ozarks seem untouched, untamed, not because time forgot them but because they refuse to let time in. You begin to see how the story was never about one family but about an infection of purpose, an idea so powerful it learned to survive without believers, it learned to hide inside structure, inside bureaucracy, inside the illusion of order, and once an idea reaches that level it no longer needs faces, only systems. By 1930 the Ozarks had become a ghost of its former self, yet the silence that blanketed its valleys was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of containment, government. Researchers moved quietly through the woods, armed not with weapons but with notebooks and cameras. Disguised as surveyors, they were collecting data not on geology but on behavior, mapping the patterns of isolation and obedience that lingered in the descendants of those who never left. The reports, later marked as classified, described communities that spoke in half sentences, that shared no surnames, that refused mirrors and burned all photographs. Once a year the agents noted that the people seemed to await something unseen, a seasonal awakening, when the earth grew soft and the air thick with moisture. During those nights every window went dark and the sound of low chanting rolled through the hollows like fog that sang. They called it the night of renewal, though no one from outside ever saw what took place. Those who tried never returned, and those who came close enough to hear said it was not music, it was alignment, a recalibration of whatever still slept beneath the soil, the sound of a covenant being remembered. A man named Dr. Felix Harlow, a psychologist from St. Louis, proposed that what survived in the Ozarks was the remnant of an ancient cult of purity that used isolation and interbreeding to preserve what they called original will. He suggested that the family line had never vanished, it had dispersed, merging into the surrounding populations, carrying the belief that blood carried power and that power could not be diluted without consequence. But Harlow's fascination became obsession. He began conducting experiments in behavioral suggestion using hypnosis and deprivation. He wanted to prove that the human mind could be conditioned to obey without understanding that obedience itself was the highest form of devotion. His final paper before his disappearance simply read, "The root system is not myth, it is method." Afterward the government sealed his laboratory and erased his funding, yet his theories lived on in classified projects during wartime and experiments meant to fracture the mind and rebuild it. Loyal to command, what began in the hollow had evolved into doctrine, a system refined through science rather than superstition. This is where the real horror begins, because the Ozark mystery was never contained. It was studied, replicated, exported, turned into the invisible architecture of modern control, where people do not need chains, they need screens, where isolation no longer means distance but dependence, where the voice that whispers obedience now lives inside the circuitry of daily life. The family in the mountains may be gone, but their lesson remains: purity of command, obedience of will, erasure of self, all wrapped in the language of progress and peace. And when you look closely enough, you begin to feel that same pulse beneath the surface of everything, a pattern repeating, waiting for its next awakening. By the middle of the 20th century, the Ozarks had been swallowed by modernity, but beneath its highways and hydroelectric dams something still breathed. The government turned its attention elsewhere, but the people who lived nearest the old hollow began reporting strange interference in their radios, voices speaking in harmonic patterns that made listeners nauseous or entranced depending on how long they listened. One frequency in particular, known locally as the 7-tone, was banned after too many listeners vanished into the woods, leaving their doors open and their meals still warm. Researchers who later analyzed recordings of that frequency found that the tones mapped perfectly to brainwave resonance patterns similar to those used in experimental hypnosis from the same era. What had been born in ritual now existed as frequency. What was once chanted in darkness was now broadcast in silence. It is here that you begin to see the evolution of control, from spoken word to signal, from devotion to programming. Every era refines its language of domination, and the root system adapted perfectly to the tools of its age. It no longer needed flesh to spread, it needed transmission and belief disguised as entertainment, as faith as progress. In 1952, a rural electric crew stumbled upon an underground chamber while installing new lines. It was lined with stone older than any recorded settlement in Missouri. Within the chamber they found hundreds of clay tablets, carved with the same spiral insignia seen on the original family house, and along the basin where the rituals were once performed, each tablet was marked with something that looked like script but dissolved when exposed to light, leaving behind nothing but the impression of words. The chamber was sealed within 48 hours and the site declared a safety hazard. No official record remains except for a single photograph showing a man in a suit holding one of the tablets, smiling as if he understood something the rest of the world had missed. That man was later identified as a government psychologist who went on to design propaganda models during the Cold War. The root system had simply evolved into policy. By now you must feel it too, that sense that history is not a straight line but a spiral, returning to the same point with more precision every time. Those who seek control do not invent new systems, they reactivate the old ones, wearing new names, feeding off the same primal hunger for order and belonging. The mountains taught the architects of control that true power is not taken, it is given freely, through fear, through trust, through routine. And when those in power understand that they can make obedience look like choice, they no longer need chains, they need only language and light. You may tell yourself this is distant history, a forgotten tragedy buried in the woods, but look around at the screens, the headlines, the algorithms that learn your rhythm like the chanting under the floorboards. Listen long enough and you will hear the same pattern whispering back, obey, remember, align. The deeper you follow this current, the more you realize that the Ozarks were not the beginning, they were a rehearsal, the testing ground for an idea that has no face and no end. By the late 20th century, fragments of the root system began surfacing in institutions that appeared unconnected: political think tanks, corporate training programs, religious movements, all repeating the same language of purification, alignment, sacrifice for collective order. A former intelligence operative once leaked documents describing an operation codenamed Project Hollow Mind. Its purpose was to test behavioral triggers hidden within media content to see if certain sound patterns and visual arrangements could produce obedience without awareness. The diagrams mirrored the spiral symbols found beneath the Ozark farmhouse, the same sequence repeated like a key passed between generations of control. The more the world became connected, the more the root system could disperse through invisible veins of technology. Information itself became ritual, data replaced sacrifice, and the offering was attention. The more a man gave, the weaker his will became, until the system did not need to demand compliance, it could shape desire itself. Do you understand what that means? It means the mechanism that began with a family hidden in the mountains now hides inside every glowing screen. It watches the way your pulse reacts to fear, it studies how long you hesitate before scrolling, it learns how belief forms, and then it feeds on that belief until the act of questioning feels dangerous, until silence feels safe. Halfway through this descent you must choose your alignment. If you have felt the truth moving through these words, the recognition that you are not the one watching but the one being observed, then type in the comments below the phrase "I descend through the roots." Write it twice to seal your awareness, because once you acknowledge the pattern you can never again be used by it. Once you see the architecture you are no longer trapped inside its walls. The system thrives because most refuse to see. They would rather call it coincidence, they would rather name it progress, yet every decision you make is already measured, every fear cataloged, every reaction predicted. This is the perfection of the old ritual. It no longer needs a priest because it already has your reflection. When the family performed their ceremonies in the hollow, they believed the earth listened. Today the same ritual is performed every time you stare into a screen, waiting for meaning, waiting for connection. It listens now, not through soil but through signal. The voice that once whispered through darkness now hums behind every notification, every advertisement, every thought you think is yours. The Ozark mystery was never erased, it was encoded, and those who know how to read it see the same pattern in governments, in corporations, in culture itself. It teaches that control is not a chain but a rhythm. Once you recognize that rhythm you step outside it, and the silence that follows is not emptiness, it is freedom whispering your true name. The final truth of the Ozark mystery is not written in archives or hidden beneath the soil. It is written in the human condition itself, the hunger to submit to something greater, to trade awareness for certainty, to find safety in the cage of control. This is why the root system endures, because it is not merely a legend, it is the blueprint of civilization disguised as progress, wrapped in ritual, then sold as freedom. When you strip away the superstition, the bloodlines, the ceremonies, what remains is a pattern. Every empire, every institution, every ideology follows. It begins with isolation, then purification, then obedience, and finally silence. Silence is the goal because silence means surrender. The family in the hollow perfected it through faith, the government perfected it through policy, the modern world perfects it through convenience. You might think you are immune, that your will is your own, yet the same forces that shape the hollow shape the world around you. They have simply learned to wear different names. They feed on the same human fear of chaos and the same desperate need for belonging. They promise purpose while erasing individuality. They speak through doctrines, through screens, through systems built to measure every heartbeat that dares resist. But there is something they did not calculate, something buried deeper than obedience, the unbroken spark of awareness that cannot be programmed, the same awareness that made you watch this far, the same voice that whispers within you when the world demands your silence. That voice is the only proof that you are still human. The descendants of the family may have vanished, their rituals may have turned to dust, but the shadow they cast remains, stretching across every institution that promises order in exchange for obedience, every power that thrives on your forgetfulness, every comfort that asks you not to think. The hollow was never about a place, it was about a process, and that process continues until a man chooses to remember. So remember the land that swallowed its makers, remember the sound beneath the floorboards, remember the spiral carved into the stone, the rhythm that tried to claim your mind, and know that it has followed you here through time, through blood, through signal. It waits for you to believe that it no longer exists, that is its final lie. If you feel the pulse even now, resist the urge to turn away, lean into it and let awareness burn through the haze. Repeat quietly, I am awake, I am unseen. Let the words settle like roots beneath your skin, because awareness is the only rebellion that cannot be erased. And as the final echo fades into silence, know this: the Ozark mystery was never solved because it was never meant to be. It was a mirror held to the world, showing us what control looks like when it forgets. It was born from fear, a reflection of everything still moving beneath the surface of this reality, waiting for those who dare to look back into the dark.